Thanks. This comes out of a paper that I've been trying to finish for a long time, working with Tom Gill, who used to be here, and some of you know him. But
Interesting.
this is a bit dark, but that's a dust storm about to hit the dairy barn on the Tech campus in the 1930s. And this was a fairly common sight at the time. People have been talking about the Dust Bowl and what caused all those dust storms since the 1930s. And simplifying a lot, it usually comes down to there's a group that says it was all a climate phenomena and another group that say the farmers caused the whole thing. And there are nuances to that. But I say if we're going to deal with causes, and I should probably put that in quotes, we need to get down to the fundamentals of what's making the soil blow. And so if we take a hypothetical piece of soil sitting on a farm somewhere in the Dust Bowl, there are certain things holding it in place, and there are certain things tending to make it move. And just to make it a little more interesting, instead of a hypothetical, well, let's call our hypothetical bit of soil Catherine. So there are things holding Catherine down, and there are things making Catherine, or trying to get Catherine to move. All right. If we look at the force of the wind applied on Catherine and all of her friends, we need to look at it from 2 points of view. One is the wind very high up, and that let's just call a natural phenomena. That's the weather, and we could probably get an argument started on whether or not humans affected wind speeds in the 1930s, but let's not go there. The other aspect is what's going on with the wind close to the ground. And for this, if you've got the same wind high up, if the ground is fairly rough, that will slow the wind down near the surface. If the ground is fairly smooth, then the wind won't be slowed nearly as much, and simplifying again, you get faster moving wind close to the ground under those conditions. Now, down near the ground, before farming, it was all grass, essentially. Then we decided, mostly in the teens and 20s, to get rid of the grass and start farming, so there's an economic decision to greatly alter the ground surface in the region. And by replacing the grass with crops, now the crops also provide roughness and slow the wind down and so on. But when a drought hits like it did in the 1930s, you get a lot of time where there's just nothing, there are no plants growing on the ground. And that's mainly a climate phenomena, but the economy is also involved. If your crop dies, if you can afford to, you come in and you replant and hope for the best. But quite often during an economic depression, people weren't able to replant. And then you've got the soil itself providing roughness to slow the wind down. And if the ground is smooth, that's very different than if the ground is rougher. And farmers learned, especially in the 30s, that it's much better to roughen up the soil to slow the wind down and cut erosion. Now, that requires money to be able to do it. You need fuel for your tractors, you need to buy a tractor, and so on. The land management part, they were learning how to adjust how they dealt with the soil to reduce erosion. And climate is a factor in there as well. So when we look at the wind, we need to see what's going on with the wind above, and that's mainly a function of climate. The crop cover is affected largely by climate, but also by the economy. The soil surface is affected by climate, but also land management practices and economic considerations. And you put all those together, and you can figure out an actual force applied to Catherine to either make her move or not. Then there's what's keeping Catherine down. We can go in lots of different versions of that, but let's go here. An individual Catherine sitting by herself is easy for the wind to move. If Catherine is attached in a clod, that's much harder for the wind to move. So Catherine needs her friends and they all have to stick together. Okay, now the reason farmers were able to go out and farm in the semi-arid high plains is people, especially a guy named Campbell, came up with a way of maintaining the soil to maximize water for agriculture. There's no irrigation going on essentially at this time. And what he said is you need to pack the soil very tightly underground. That draws water up into the root zone and helps the crops stay, because everything relied on rainfall and what you can maximize in the soil. But to prevent erosion, you need a layer of loose soil, a couple inches thick, just sitting there. And Campbell knew that erosion was a problem, and he said you need little clumps of soil, but this was called a soil mulch. And that, again, sort of insulated the soil below and reduced evaporation. So it helped maximize the available soil moisture. Now that mulch of little clumps, first, big clumps are much better if you're thinking about erosion, but little clumps over time, as the soil was worked over and over again, and drought hit and various other things happened, those little clumps became very fine bits of soil. And so they started, instead of calling it a soil mulch, it was a dust mulch. You see people describing the soils. Farmers were pulverizing the earth. Soil was as fine as face powder. That's very easy to erode. Okay, that cohesion, what's holding Catherine and all her friends together, is affected by organic matter, clays, and soil moisture. The organic matter was very high before they started farming because it's dense root systems and the grasses and so on. But as soon as they plowed it up to farm, we started losing all that organic matter. It decayed as erosion happened, some of it blew away, and so on. The clays, over time, clays get drawn down lower into the soil, carried by water percolating into the soil. So what we need are clays at the surface to reduce erosion, but they were being drawn deeper and deeper. And in the 30s, farmers realized that they needed to bring clays back up to the surface, but it wasn't until the late 30s and in the 40s and 50s that tractors became powerful enough to actually do what they call deep plowing and bring the lower soils back up to the surface. And clays also simply got blown away with the rest of the soil. Okay, and then soil moisture to help hold the particles together. The drought was a big factor here, and how farmers tilled the soil affected soil moisture as well. So when you put these together, what's holding Catherine in place, you've got clays, which are affected by climate and land management practices, organic matter, land management, and I'm throwing economy in just because we farmed there, that was an economic decision. And then soil moisture, affected by climatic factors, land management, and economic factors. So when we put all of these together, what we've got is a whole bunch of different factors affected by a whole bunch of different phenomena. And again, it comes down to if these things are stronger than these things, Catherine's going to stay in place. If the force of the wind is greater than the resistance of the soil particles, Catherine and all her friends are going to blow. So if there's a point to all of this, is if we're going to talk about causes, they only make sense in context with all the other factors affected. In the 1930s, there was a combination of a bunch of things going on that led to a lot of erosion. If we move up to the 1950s, when we had a drought that in many places was more severe than in the 1930s, there was still a lot of dust blowing, but farmers were in much better shape because the economy was healthy, they knew a lot more, they had better equipment, and so on. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Dad. So does that mean if there's another dust bowl, I leave?
Yeah.
All right.
No, we don't want that to happen.
Other questions?
Yeah.
So, were the average wind speeds during this period any higher or lower than any other time? Did I know that?
Some people think they were, but there isn't good evidence. Actually, Richard Peterson in the back might have a thought or three about that, but we don't know is my answer. Yeah, Neil?
In the 50s, in the summer, I worked in the wheat harvest in Kansas, and in the area where I was working, there were shelter belts, and you could see what those shelter belts were doing during a black soil storm when you went down a dirt road, perpendicular to the belts. And we had some out here in the Panhandle, but by and large, we have cut them all down.
Right.
Has Kansas or any other state either given incentives or have any farmers planted them once again to, in effect, create a much higher surface that's rough to slow down the wind?
I am not aware of anyone putting in shelter belts. They were taken out because bigger farm equipment, bigger fields, we needed the room. And so they were seen as in the way. Another thing, the Dust Bowl is the more western part of the plains. And shelter belts really didn't get started until the late 30s and beyond, so they didn't have much of an effect on the 1930s Dust Bowl. And in most of the Dust Bowl, it was just too dry to get trees to grow. So they caught on in wetter parts of the region. Yeah, John?
Jeff, one of the things we do know now in terms of plants and soil interaction with all those particles is a lot of the symbiotic fungi produce a protein called glomalin. And that's one of the things that grasses are noted for. And so one of the problems with agriculture is a lot of the plants we plant no longer form those symbiotic relationships. So one of the reasons why agricultural soils are still prone to blow is you don't have those beneficial fungi most of the time producing all this compound that it's the organic matter that sticks those things together. And so once you get any drought that prevents plants from growing, then the glomalin's not there and the stuff starts to fall apart rather rapidly. And so for agricultural systems, the input this is to figure out how do you get that material back in the systems quickly enough to be able to get them to stick. And interesting enough, the other place that this comes to play quite a bit is on beaches and beach erosion. That's one of the reasons why beach grasses are very effective. It's not the plant itself, it's that the fungus actually binds all those small particles together pretty effectively.
So is it the problem of having this monocrop that prevents these fungi from growing? Or
No,
what's the agricultural practice?
What happens is we bred out the ability of most cotton to form mycorrhizae because we don't select for it. And so when you breed out, when you put in pathogen resistance, the plant responds to any fungus as a pathogen. And then the other one is we fertilize it so far too much, and so that kills all the beneficial organisms.
Just a little added bit. Paul Carlson in History interviewed a bunch of people around here about what's called Black Sunday in 1935, the worst of the dust storms. And here on campus, when West Hall was still a dormitory, he talked to a fellow who said midway between the administration building and West Hall on the tech campus, the weather became so dark that the young man could not see his hand in front of his face. He struggled to find West Hall, and when he did find it, he staggered in the front door exhausted. He had a hard time breathing. He was dusty and dirty looking, and I thought he was going to faint as he fell against the wall. This was rough times. A student a long time ago said his neighbor was a janitor here in the 30s, and they would use shovels to clean out the hallways after these storms, so. Now it's a nuisance. Then it was serious, yeah. Yeah,
Just a
Richard.
minor point, you mentioned how the period of the 50s was in a different place. 2 years running, Scientific American had feature articles on the return of the Dust Bowl.
Right.
And they were talking about here rather than up to the north.
Right.
In the southeastern Colorado and so forth. And one of the illustrations was from near Lamesa, so.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
All right.